This week we begin the Classical Era. This is a time period from 1750 to 1820. It comes immediately following the Baroque period that you've just learned about over the past 2 weeks. This week you're going to learn about the transition from the Baroque to the Classical, how the Classical period and its society functioned and how it was different from the Baroque, and how that society shaped the music of the time. Once you know the history of the period, then we'll talk about the characteristics of classical music, just as we did with the Baroque period. Once you know that, we'll talk about the forms of classical music, because form is actually one of the most essential and important parts of classical music from the classical period of 1750 to 1820. The beginning of the classical era for music began in 1750, but there was a period of transition from about 1730 to 1770 known as the pre-classical period. This was the time in which J.S. Bach had his 20 children. Remember that among those 20 children were 4 composers. These 4 sons that became composers were really the best of the pre-classical composers and helped to make their father's music go out of fashion. They were more interested in the ideas of clarity, simplicity, and balance, rather than the ideas of complexity and using polyphony to create music. Because they really leaned on this idea of balance and clarity in their music, they created beautiful, tuneful melodies that helped us transition into the classical musical era. And they really strayed from this idea that complex music with polyphony was what was most important. That is why, when J.S. Bach died in 1750, it's considered the end of the Baroque and the beginning of the Classical, because his music was finally out of fashion. But there were other reasons that this happened to music besides the death of J.S. Bach. Why did music need to change to emphasize clarity, simplicity, and balance? It was society and its needs and wants that created the new trends in music and compositional style of the period. On this slide, you're going to see 2 different examples of the art of the period. On the previous slide, there was another. They all show the elegance and balance. In particular, the architecture picture that you see here below shows the idea that balance was so important to this society. But society was changing. It was drastically changing during this period. And the 2 things that were changing the most were the fact that society was involved in a new philosophical movement called the Enlightenment, and society was being challenged every day in all of the countries in Europe, and even in the United States at its birth, because revolutions and wars were occurring all the time during these 70 years. As you know, in the Baroque, there were many philosophical movements that led society towards the music it chose as its popular music. The same was true of the Classical era. The Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that believed that reason was the best guide for human behavior, was one of the most important trends in society at the time. Philosophers in this period believed in the idea of progress, in creating better things for human beings, not to be stuck in the past. They might still be inspired by ideas and classical elements of the past, but they wanted to move forward to new and more exciting things. It was during the Enlightenment that the attacks upon the clergy and aristocracy really began in earnest. They attacked the clergy and aristocracy for its inhumanity and decadence. As you know, a lot of the music of the Baroque was formed because the men that controlled society that were rich were bored and needed things to entertain them. It's where opera actually came from. But now, people were seeing that the aristocracy and clergy were too powerful for their own good, and they wanted to recreate society based off of new class systems that really gave all human beings power. Because of this, philosophers, some of the aristocracy, and most of the poor really applauded and helped this idea of the middle class. They really wanted the middle class to struggle to free itself from oppression from the higher classes. The middle class was a new class of people. Before, you were either poor or wealthy. But at the beginning of the classical period, there were more and more merchants, shopkeepers, people that were in trades where they could make money, and they were making enough money to be comfortable with their lives and to not have to serve the aristocracy or the clergy, the church. So the middle class was gaining a lot of power, and it was supported by the philosophical movement of the time. Even some monarchs were influenced by this particular trend, and so they abolished serfdom, tried to take power away from the churches, and held nobility accountable for crimes for the first time in history.
The classical era was also an age of wars and revolutions. A few of them are listed here: the 7 Years' War, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars. These were large conflicts that caused a lot of upheaval in society. It meant that everything was being challenged and changed. War and revolution made everyone a little bit afraid of what their lives were going to be. They never knew whether another war was going to break out or another revolution was going to change society for the worse or better. Many people were going around saying slogans such as liberty, equality, and fraternity. Because of these wars and revolutions, people had finally begun to believe that all men were created equal and deserved the right to rule their own lives and not be overpowered by the richer people on the planet. So many things in society during the classical era changed because of these revolutions and because of the ideas of the Enlightenment. You had the rise of the middle class, something we've already addressed. I can't tell you how important this really was. It changed the music of the era because it allowed people the freedom to be amateur musicians themselves and to demand new kinds of art. An amateur musician is someone who knows something about playing an instrument and simply plays for the hobby or pleasure of playing it. They're not necessarily great at the instrument, and they don't try to use the instrument as a profession in which to make money. They simply play for the pleasure of doing so, not at the best level, but at a respectable level. This kind of musician really was on the rise because of the middle class. You now had a class in society that was not so poor that they couldn't even find enough food, and yet they weren't rich enough to be bored and create new kinds of music for themselves simply because they wanted something else entertaining. Instead, this class had just enough money in which they could have hobbies. They had enough to survive, not worry about where their food was coming from each day, and live in nice places, but not enough to simply be rich. What they wanted to spend that extra money on was more education and more music and art, because these were things that had been in the Baroque entirely powered by the aristocracy and the church. No one in the poorer communities was allowed an education or was allowed the chance to provide music for themselves. Once the middle class had risen and had a great place in society in this period, more and more people were amateur musicians, and they demanded more and more concerts and music. It meant that there were more concerts available to them. More concert halls were built. More music was being written for this particular type of musician as well. Not only so they could go to more concerts to hear the music, but so they could buy scores of music to bring into their own homes and create their own concert settings. One other thing that happened because of the revolutions and the Enlightenment was that Vienna in Austria became the greatest art capital of the world. Before this, much of Italy was important in the development of music, as was part of Germany because of the power of the church. But as the classical period moved forward, more and more philosophers and artists and more aristocracy and church that had much power moved to Vienna. It was considered the art capital because it was one of the greatest cities of the time. It had one of the biggest thriving middle classes, and it still had a large aristocratic population that would come in, especially in the winters, and bring full orchestras with them. It meant that the greatest composers of the time eventually would all end up in Vienna writing music and making it available for popular demand. If you want to know more about Vienna or any of the revolutions or the Enlightenment, please feel free to look that up in your history textbooks or find some online sources that will tell you about those things. They are important to know just a little bit about because they help everyone in the class to realize that they changed how music sounded and acted and what it was needed and wanted for in this particular period. Because of the revolutions, the Enlightenment, the changes in concert availability and the rise of the middle class and the amateur musician, there was a new demand for balance and structure in both life and art. People responded to the need to overcome this idea of revolution where every man was equal and yet society was stable. And so they really wanted balance and structure in the things they could control. So they demanded balance and structure not only in their lives, but in their art, in music. And that is how the new classical style developed. After the pre-classical period, that transitionary period, composers really wanted to move away from the Baroque sound and ideas so they could better serve this new audience, especially the new middle class. This desire was also influenced by one other aspect of society, the patronage system. First off, what is patronage? A patron is someone who's a rich benefactor that funds and controls the lives of artists. So the patronage system was a system in which people from the aristocracy and church would fund and control the lives of the musicians and artists. Especially in the Baroque period, this is how musicians survived. You already know that the church and the aristocracy acted as benefactors or patrons for composers in particular. They simply would have composers sign a contract, and those composers were given a home, they were given food, they were given a salary, but they were slaves to the courts and had no freedom. This was a very good example of what the patronage system was. In the classical period, this was still true. Even though the church and the aristocracy were being challenged and attacked by the philosophies of the time, patronage still really did control the artist population at the beginning of the classical period. They still had extreme power over the composers. We'll learn more about this when we talk about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven next week. But what you need to know about the period now in regards to patronage is that as the era progressed, as time passed and it became the later classical period, the patronage system broke down. This happened because the aristocracy and the church were losing power and control over society. The rise of the middle class was allowing for more freedom, and composers finally, by the end of the period, were able to break away from this slavery, this patronage system, and they were able to support themselves financially for the first time in history. This really changed how music was written, how it was styled, and how composers were able to live their lives freely. Now for some listening. At this point, you should better understand the changes that were happening in Europe and across the world at the end of the Baroque period that led into the beginning of the classical period. You can now understand why music had to change. It had a new society that wanted and needed new things. Remember that music is always changing because it reflects the wants and needs of a society. The music of the Baroque and Classical were no different than the music of today. It was simply what a society needed and wanted to hear. So without really knowing anything about the actual sound characteristics of the music, let's listen to a few examples of Baroque and Classical music to see whether you can hear a few of the differences I'm talking about. The first two listening examples are paired. First, you should listen to the Bach Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, Movement 1. This should sound familiar. It's here not only so that you can review what that sounded like from your listening from last week, 2 weeks ago actually, but it's here so that you can compare it to a classical concerto movement. I've provided the links below, and as usual, you can go ahead and pause this once I'm finished talking about the examples and go to the chapter folder and click on examples 1 and 2. One of these examples is obviously Baroque, Bach's Brandenburg Concerto, written near the end of the Baroque period. The other one, Beethoven's Violin Concerto, is classical. I simply want you to think about what are the differences that you hear. Is one of these concertos more emotional or more complex than the other? Does one have more tuneful melodies? Which do you actually like better and why? You don't need to listen to the full excerpts. Both of these links have the entire concerto. You simply need to listen to the first movement. So now please pause this slide and go and listen to the two examples. Once you're done, please click on play because there's one more set of listening examples I'd like to talk to you about. Listening examples 3 and 4 are also a pair of Baroque and classical pieces. Monteverdi's Tu sei morta should be quite familiar, and something you haven't heard yet, an aria from an opera from the classical period of Mozart's called Don Giovanni, and it's called Leporello's Catalogue aria. These two pieces of music are very similar to each other in form, but sound very, very different. So, what can you hear that's different? Is it the emotion, the tone color, the complexity of the melodies? What is it that makes these two examples different? And again, which do you like better and why? So, please go and listen to these examples now. And once you've thought through all 4 of these listening examples, move on to the next lecture so that you can understand better the characteristics that have changed music so much during the classical period. Once you've listened to the next lecture, you're going to be able to better understand the new classical music you just listened to. So if you feel like it, go back and listen to some more. But we'll listen to a lot more examples in the 3rd lecture on form. So either way, even if you don't go back and listen to these first 4 again right away after the next lecture, you will understand the characteristics better once you've listened to the rest of the listening examples for the unit.